Hi, this is Brian with Embrilliance. Today we're going to look at a feature in StitchArtist level 2 and above, which creates underlay in satin columns for 3D foam. One of the most enjoyable parts of my job is seeing what people do with the technology that we create. Here is an example created by Lisa Shaw of Sew Bubbles, and it's one of the first things she did when I gave her the ability to beta test the 3D foam underlay. This is the working file that she used to create this design, and you can see it's a series of satin columns. We'll open up the objects pane and have a look, and let's take a closer look at some of the connection points. And we'll turn 3D off so you can see what's going on. In this case, we have a satin column coming up, and you'll see a bunch of stitching underneath that acts as an underlay, which bridges the vertical column and the horizontal column. This type of stitching that extends past this object into the other object as an underlay is called a join, and in commercial circles, sometimes they call it a plank. And the idea here is that we're working with puffy foam, which has a very high density to the satin stitch, and that wants to create a series of cuts to cut the foam out, but at the join you want to smooth that out. You want it to look a little bit more joined. If we look over here at this area, you can see that the satin stitch comes to an end, and where you have open stitching at the end, the foam itself doesn't get cut. So we want to add stitching in to cut the foam, as well as sort of create a cap effect that makes it so that the end satin stitch, this last stitch that runs across here, we want that to not simply look open with the foam under it. We want to encapsulate the foam fully. So this is called a cap or a foam cap, and this is a foam join. Now, the way we create these, I'll show you in the next slide. Let's make a simple object, something that we can turn into a satin stitch quite easily. And for this purpose, I'm going to turn my hard points on. I'm going to draw with points, and we'll go perhaps over here. I'm going to use the Shift key so I get a nice horizontal line. Shift key again for a nice vertical line. Shift key again, and I'll just Control right click to close the object. And I'm going to add an inclination line in here as well. Right click, the object is set up, and we'll zoom in on this and turn the 3D off. Here we see a pretty typical satin stitch. If we take a look at the sewing simulator, we'll see an edge run going around the object, and then a zigzag underlay, and then a satin stitch back. If we take a look at the properties of this object, we can see that it's a normal 4-point density. The edge run and the parallel underlay are set. And let's go and take a look at the type of stitch this is. In the past, you've seen normal, contour, contour 2, fringe left, fringe right, and now we have a new option, foam. When we click on foam, we get a very high density, 1.8. That sounds like it should be too high a density for your machine, but believe it or not, it's perfect for cutting out the foam, and the machines are not unhappy with it. The only thing with a high density is this satin doesn't turn. You don't want satins that turn really tightly when you've got the high density. If you have to have a shape that turns, you can, of course, adjust the density to whatever you need. One of the things that we talk about with foam is having satin stitches that don't turn extremely tightly. And Lisa had learned this when she was first working with this Joy design, and she shared it with us so that we could see the before and after effect. So if we take a look at this one, this was the first one, and we'll go ahead and zoom in pretty tightly on the bottom of the J. Here, if we turn off the stitches, you can see how it generated, and we can use the density map, And you can see the red area, if you will. That is an area that could be a problem stitching for the machine. If we click the density map again, you can see the wire line, and you'll see this sort of X-ray view where it's very bright in certain areas. If we take a look over at the design that she wound up with, you can see a much smoother curve, and it's actually a lot prettier to boot. If we go ahead and zoom in on that one, take a look at the stitching and the density map, we can see much less red, and the wire line has no glowy spots. So that actually sewed out really, really nice, as we could see from the photo slides at the start of the video. Now, when we set foam, this adds the parallel zigzag underlay, and it also sets our foam ends, which is again found under the underlay tab, foam end 1 to cap, foam end 2 to cap. So we have three styles of capping. We have none, which of course is what you would normally get, a cap, which prevents the foam from being visible under the end of the satin stitch, and a joint, which is used to combine the underlay with some other underlay, perhaps of another foam object. So let's run the simulator on this. So there's our edge run. There's our joint. There's the rest of our parallel stitching. Here's our cap stitch. You'll notice these are feathered so that we don't cut an internal line in the foam. And now we'll go ahead and complete the satin stitch in the object. Let's complete the design by turning this into a very simple uppercase T. We'll go ahead and select the design and give it a rotation, zoom back out, and let's just copy and paste it so we don't have to redraw it, and turn that one into the vertical. Now we'll set this up. I'm going to hit A for all on my keyboard, and we'll take this column, look at its properties, and turn the join into a cap. One thing I should show you is how you can tell which end is which when using the foam. Here I'm going to make a simple column. Right click to end, set it to satin. I've got the stitches turned off, but I'll turn them on so you can see what's happening. And you'll notice that when we have any kind of a drawing, there's a start and a stop point. That's basically the first point that was used in the creation of the outline. In the case of a closed outline, like we use with a satin stitch, that point's going to be red. And that red dot marks the entry or exit of the outline, and we're going to use the end of the satin column that's closest to that to be end 1. So this is going to be the end 1. So if I turn my stitches on, let's put the 3D on, and you'll see that's currently capped because that's how we were digitizing. If I set end 1 to join, you'll see that comes out. So if you want, you can just decide to try it. Sometimes trial and error is going to be the easiest way for selecting the end positions, but you can actually look at it and see which is which. Before we go, we should take another look at the end points on satin designs and see if there are ways in the shape we can construct a better shape to close the ends. And we're going to do this with a normal satin column, and we'll create our input, and we'll start to make a curve and right click to end the object. And I'm going to set it for normal for now and turn the 3D off so that we can zoom in on this. And let's take a look at end number 2 over here. And you can see that we've got a cap on it. Let's set that to none. And let's look at this. We have this long stitch at the end, and that is going to allow us to see the foam, which is why we're using the cap. But we can actually reduce this a little bit very simply by grabbing that shape and curving it. A lot of people didn't know that you can do that in StitchArtist, but you certainly can. And now when we go and put the cap on it, you'll see there's far less stitching required to close that shape. Similarly, if we were going to create a design that we could taper, and I'll go ahead and make one of those, then the taper obviously is going to give us a much smaller cap. So the more you can taper or the more you can round off your ends, the better your result is going to be. Coming back to the T that we created, as you can see, the underlays are all working, but they are separately placed on each object. Object 1 will sew out first with all of its underlay, and then object 2 will stitch out with its underlay. Just a little teaser here for you though. Our next video is going to cover a new feature, which is branching. Here I've selected these two columns, and I'll click the branch, and what that allows to happen is for the underlays of both to sew out together, which certainly helps with registration issues as well as smoothness of sewing and entry and exit for the entire object. Let me show you here by accelerating the simulation. Okay, so here we exited on the top left, but when we select the first object in the branch, we have new kinds of entry and exits that we can use to end and exit wherever we want. And that'll be in the next video. So thanks, and we'll see you soon.